In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Magazine readers and Sublation Media viewers. It's me, Douglas Lain. I'm here with Djene Bajalan. We are doing our weekly live stream in which we speak to authors and try to discuss some of the issues of the day, hit the news cycle, and determine the relevance of the news cycle to the left. I'm Douglas Lain again.
And I'm Jamie Bajalan, in for Ashley Frowley. So all you Ashley fans out there, I am sorry to disappoint.
I'm sure they're not disappointed. You're a beautiful man. So before we begin, I want to ask you all to like and subscribe and hit the bell, all that YouTube stuff. Also, to make sure you keep up to date with Sublation Magazine's latest content, follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And if you have, go ahead.
We have an exciting new article out today by Stephen Hamill called Critical Race Theory, Law and Marxism. So a quite topical thing that I would definitely recommend that people check out if they can. And we have some exciting things coming this week. So hopefully we'll have something published every day of the week this week. And a lot of very interesting authors coming, which I don't want to ruin the surprise.
Okay, yeah. I just want to also let people know that my backdrop and my high definition camera is I'm not using those this week because there was a frame rate issue and I got lazy about the backdrop. So this is more like a regular diet soap backdrop, but soon enough, everything is going to be professionalized. We're going to have the best production values. I'm going to be replaced by a supermodel. I also want to remind everyone that you can support us on Patreon. You could drop a super chat if you really felt flush and wanted to throw some money our way. Tomorrow, we are going to be hosting a debate between Slavoj Žižek and Terry Pinkard on the topic of interpreting Hegel and the significance of Hegelian thought for today's left. We hope that will be a big deal. And we are asking people to join a virtual watch party on our Discord that's going to be starting at 9 a.m. tomorrow, that specific time. And I'm sending out links to the Discord to the patrons, but also I'll drop a link to the Discord in the chat sometime during the show. You can also find it later on in the description for this video. I'll put the link to Discord there so you can join us for a virtual watch party as we let Žižek and Terry Pinkard go at it. We're also starting meetups in Chicago, Miami, San Diego. Those will be on Friday, and there'll be one in Brooklyn on Saturday. If you want to go, or if you want to start a meetup in your city, just shoot our guy Clint an email, and his email is Clint, that's CLINTM, at sublationmedia.com. Clint is an admin at Sublation, and he'll let you know where the meetings are being held or how to set one up. And I will also put his email in the description for this video, probably about 2 hours after this is done. Finally, our patrons will get access to a second live stream this morning, wherein Spencer Leonard and Deep State Kuba will join us to discuss the crisis in Sri Lanka. But right now, we have a great show in which we'll be talking about Nomiki Konst's New York State Senate campaign and her campaign against Kristen Gonzalez. I mean, these are the two left candidates that are duking it out right now. And we'll talk to the Sublation Magazine author, Jamie Keesling, about her essay, Hope Despite All Doubts. We'll be asking what type of person would make the claims that Nietzsche did, and also ask whether a Nietzschean approach to philosophical evaluation, a mode of inquiry that looks beyond the validity of arguments and truth claims to consider the presuppositions and historical values underlying those claims, are adequate for people who are struggling for freedom today. So, Djene, why don't you start this conversation about the New York Senate campaign?
Yeah, so obviously there's this New York state level race taking place. I think there's been some redistricting in New York. And obviously one of the interesting tendencies of the last couple of years has been, the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America as probably the largest group in America laying claim to the socialist legacy, and their attempts to engage in electoral politics. And, some of the candidates, people will know there's the Squad, which has been endorsed and backed by Democratic Socialists of America. Although I would note, I think people often misunderstand the relationship between DSA and some of those individuals. DSA, for example, was not the only political force. For example, behind AOC, there were, left-wing members of the Democratic Party who were involved in her run as well. But we see at the local level this strategy taking place where, we see it in Chicago. I think there are campaigns on the west coast of the United States, and of course in New York City, where they have candidates. And obviously their strategy is to run in Democratic Party primaries.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously win the general election, because these are kind of like one-party states. It's like running on a Republican ticket is pointless.
Mm-hmm.
And running as a Democrat is, functionally, at least according to their argument, that's the methodology that they want to use in order to get representation at the city level.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a controversy in this run, because there are two ostensibly left-wing candidates. As you mentioned at the top, there is Nomiki Konst, and then there's Kristen Gonzalez. Gonzalez is obviously the DSA endorsed candidate who has come up through the process of the DSA. And then you have Nomiki Konst, who has, jumped into the race. And, there's been a lot of
Nomiki is part of the, bread tube, or not, maybe bread tube's the wrong word, but part of the new left media landscape. She came up from the Young Turks. She has her own show. She's friends with some of the people who are friends of mine through my days at Zero Books, like Harvey K. And she has her own kind of reputation on the left as a left commentator.
Yeah, so she's worked as a journalist amongst other things, but works as a journalist. So she has she's what would you call it? Left media personality, journalist, that kind of person. But also, I think it's important to emphasize not just a media personality. She was involved in the 2008 Obama campaign. She she was involved in some, NGO industrial complex work. She was in Libya at one point, involved in, some kind of, people always say, oh, she was a CIA operative in Libya. And I was like, well, that's not exactly how it works. But, you have these NGOs that go out there, like do-gooders who go out there and, get parachuted down to empower women, whatever. But she was involved in that. She ran or attempted to run for Congress in Arizona, where she's from. She was run for the New York public advocate position and lost, and she's running for this seat now. And herself she's obviously of Greek origin, but her mother, I believe, was a lawmaker at the state level, I think in New York State. So I would say that she is her political education is partly in the apparatus. And of course she was a member of the Bernie campaign, not to forget that. It's within the apparatus of the Democratic Party in one hand, within the NGO industrial complex, and then within the media field as well. So
I want to point out that she came into this race late, according to a commenter, and she was running against a candidate who, as you said earlier, is part of a slate.
Yes.
In the DSA. So if she were to win, it would do damage to the DSA strategy.
Well, not only that, she might also run as a spoiler, and I believe there's a member of the Crowley dynasty running in that seat as well. So, the more conspiratorial people are saying, she entered the race late in order to act as a spoiler candidate.
Yeah, in order to help the more mainstream candidate.
Yes, again, I don't really believe that, but that is the general claim.
Well, I mean, it could be the result, regardless of whatever her
intentions are. Exactly. There's the road to hell is paved with
all sorts of intentions,
all sorts of and bad ones. But what I find interesting, and Doug, if you've looked at the platforms of both these candidates, right?
Yeah, I have them like in front of me here. Just to give you a sense of it, they both have embraced the New York Health Act, which is a single payer act. I believe that they both embrace that because Gonzalez says that she wants to create single payer healthcare in New York, and there's an act that's up for a vote, the New York Health Act, which is single payer. They both have plans to guarantee housing, slightly different language from the two candidates. Gonzalez is more straightforward about this in her language. Nomiki wants to extend the unemployment assistance at $600 a week, I think, permanently. She mentions raising the minimum wage to $30 an hour, creating a state fund for research into long COVID. I didn't see those particular planks in Gonzalez's platform, but I would be surprised if she opposed the $30 an hour minimum wage. So there's a lot of similarities on paper between the two candidates.
Yeah. So I think, people have, focused on the drama between them. I think there's been some exchanges on Twitter. Nomiki Konst has accused, Gonzalez supporters of harassment, and there's been accusations from the Gonzalez camp that Nomiki Konst is doing dirty tricks and racist dog whistles. There's kind of, there's a political hardball taking place.
Can I read the tweet that
yeah, go ahead. Put it up can you put it up on the screen?
Maybe. I don't have it pulled and ready, but maybe I could try to. But here's the see if there is anything in StreamYard where I can just do that. I can put it. Yeah, here's what I can do. I can
share screen.
Yeah, I can do this. So, Gonzalez, for New York, your actions have consequences. Your tactics against us have encouraged supporters of yours to threaten, harass, and physically intimidate me, our team, and supporters. We don't feel safe, and it's got to end now. Nobody should be afraid to run, speak out, or campaign.
I have to say, imagine being scared of DSA supporters. It's like, what? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a very hyperbolic language, but actually the political platforms, whether you believe that either for Cecile or not, are quite similar, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we're dealing with here is not really like a big political difference. Both are hoping to enact kind of traditional New Deal style / social democratic politics, trying to, do a public goods, public goods type of politics where, they're like, hey, we're going to actually give working people some benefits, do some redistributive politics. And, me, Doug, I'm a black pill social democrat. The world's going to end. At least can we have some healthcare and some childcare help and things like that.
In terms of Warhammer miniatures, what would DSA hecklers be? I want to say something about the harassment that Nomiki is talking about. Apparently, there was an individual who may just be
a lunatic.
A lunatic, or I was going to say mentally ill, but a lunatic is fine. Who did threaten their campaign people on the streets in New York. Whether or not that has anything to do with the Gonzalez campaign is debatable. Gonzalez says they, of course, had nothing to do with them, but that did happen. And sometimes, random people can be quite dangerous, as we've been seeing in the last month or so with the
Yeah, of
shooters and
course.
so on.
Of course. But, obviously it's like a very like, I don't know, call the manager language, I suppose people would interpret it as. And, it's being deployed in this thing. But, that's what people focus on. But they don't focus on the fact that, these the policies of these people, at least what they're advocating formally, are quite simple. So what is the source of the tension, right? And I think what I find interesting about the race is not actually the drama. I think that's kind of funny and like salacious, and a lot of left media is about salacious topics, right? But I think it represents something deeper about the fragmentation of the Bernie coalition, right? I mean, I don't know. I think between 2015 and the end of the, and the beginning of the Biden presidency, we had on the left, or the self-described left, we had an era of good feelings, to use an American metaphor. The left, ranging from left-wing Democrats, right, people like Nomiki Konst, who were alienated by the failures of the Obama presidency to deliver like material public goods policies on the line of the New Deal. And I don't think it's an accident that one of Nomiki Konst's intellectual mentors is Harvey Kay, one of the like big proponents of what I would call New Deal fetishism. Those people. And then, the older forms of, political traditions that laid claim to the socialist legacy overtly, ranging from, the social Jacobin people, as well as a lot of people who have been involved in the social democratic and the socialist left and the sectarian left for a long time. For different reasons, many of them rallied behind the Bernie campaign. Some people thought it was an opportunity to genuinely affect policy of the Democratic Party. Some people, like Adolf Reed, regarded it as the best we can do at the moment, and an opportunity to, get people experience organizing, to like get the left off the ground after a really dead period of politics between the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the Occupy movement, which the Occupy movement was really the culmination of, because it was the sort of anarchist response to the failures of globalization and the economic crisis, and it just sputtered out. So we ended up with this, people going back to embracing this socialist tradition. And really, Sanders rallied these forces together because of his charisma, because he, whatever one thinks of his politics, he seems like a good faith actor. He's someone who does have a kind of legacy in left politics. He has been involved in left wing movements for a long time. He's like a dinosaur come back to life, or like a Rip Van Winkle politics who's went out of fashion and then came back into he's like Flares or something, or some kind of like fashion that comes back. But the Sanders movement has, not only did it fail to elect Sanders as the president, its ability to build a meaningful social democratic left congressional delegation has stalled. And the Biden presidency has, even by the metrics of even relatively conservative Democratic voters, has been a failure. And this obviously has implications for the left, the majority of whom are in one way or another engaged in a type of electoral politics. And so even though Nomiki Konst and Kristen Gonzalez don't have different platforms, they represent a kind of different strategy of politics. Whatever people think of the DSA, whether they're like real socialists or they're just fakers or what have you, I called them the social democratic left, and people got upset with me on Twitter because they because I know we're democratic socialists. It's like, okay, well, okay, you could be whatever you want to call it. Like, so they do represent a movement that comes out of the socialist tradition.
Yeah. We're getting an interruption from real life.
We're getting
yeah, but I'll just say, I'll mute you for a moment. You can talk to your kid. So I'll just say that difference in strategy and the kind of politics that the two candidates have would be consequential only in one way, I think, which is if the you have to assume that the DSA candidates would be less likely to compromise on legislation and their principles because they're part of a slate than the progressive Democrat. And I'm not entirely sure that that's borne out by what we've seen so far from AOC and others. But the idea is about creating something along the lines like party discipline. Right?
But yes, yeah. I mean, I think that's the theory. Now, of course, there's been like questions at the congressional level about, being able to discipline people like AOC. There are whole reasons why that is a problematic proposition in the first place. Again, as I emphasize, AOC was not like a total DSA creation. There was a whole number of forces that competed to create to build that campaign. But yes, I think the notion of DSA, which I think it's not I think at least if you're on the left, you would kind of say this is a minimum requirement, is that you should be running candidates that come up through the process of the movement of the party and thus can be pressured and disciplined by the party. Now, once they get into office, whether that strategy will be successful or not is a different question. But I think the different style of politics that we're dealing with here is that the progressives, and I think the term is pretty helpful in this context, they view politics. They may have similar policy objectives, but they and I'm sure if you spoke to Nomiki Konst, she would be arguing that like DSA is a corrupt organization, and she is an individual with a CV that is a good CV, that she's going to say, I did all these things. I'm a professional politician. You should elect me because I'm the only one who can take over take on these corrupt interests, whether they're like DSA, whether it's the Democratic Party. It is like a very individualist, professional managerial class, apparatchik style of politics. Whereas DSA, again, with the caveat of all the flaws, is attempting to do this more grassroots process. And that difference, which I think is meaningful because it sorts out the movement between people who regard themselves as being in the left tradition and those who regard themselves as, let's just say, left-wing Democrats. I think that difference is coming to the fore. I think it's coming to the fore for other reasons. The Ukraine war has done this. Nomiki Konst, for example, was making hints, on Twitter about like the need for congressional investigations for people who are getting Russian money. Sorry, I have to give my son.
So that's okay. Hey, what we should do, I think, is if we can, get Nomiki on a Sublation Magazine Show or on Diet Soap or something, because I think we could ask her directly whether or not what gives her makes her the better candidate is her ability to navigate the system as it is and get things accomplished as a professional politician, or whether she would be joining with other progressive candidates to try to establish a kind of a power block within the New York Senate. Because that's the other approach, right? Is to not to negotiate the system and broker deals as a polished politician, but rather to just stand firm, be uncompromising, and develop the power you need to be able to get your agenda through.
It would be interesting to speak to both candidates because I think it could be illuminating in seeing what is happening with that Bernie coalition. I think I have sympathy for the DSA strategy, but again, one question I would want to ask Gonzalez is like, so how would DSA, if DSA is back, how would they discipline you as someone elected to office? What what does that mean? And there may there's always difficulties when you get to when you enter into electoral politics over whether
they could withdraw their endorsement. I suppose they could.
The question becomes then, for example, if DSA unendorsed AOC, I don't think it would make a blind bit of difference. If they unendorsed Jamal Bowman, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. My question is, like, is DSA able to make or break political candidates? And that's really what matters. If you're going to pursue the electoral strategy and you're going to do it through the Democratic Party, which I will, which I'll say is like, because of the nature of the American party system, I think there are like very good reasons to try and pursue that strategy. It only works if you can actually make or break elections with an endorsement. If you can't, you're just knocking on doors and you're just providing free labor. And what my criticism of the DSA would be is, it's not simply, if you're going to want to play hardball and get this discipline in, it's not simply good enough, for example, not to endorse someone. You have to actively be a spoiler so that you can like leverage yourself. Because I kind of feel like the left electoral strategy, it doesn't have the stick side that is required to make it a viable strategy. And I don't know if we're going to get there. I don't see any other strategy in town at the moment, but that's just my perhaps unhelpful critique of the existing system.
Well, we should follow up on this story, see if we can get both candidates on maybe next week or the week after, sometime soon, because I think it's worth taking a look at. Maybe not because the election itself is going to be so consequential, but just because it allows us to think about politics and actual real life politics. Right now, though, we should go to Jamie Keesling, who's been waiting patiently to come on. What I'm going to do is run a clip from Rick Roderick before I start the interview here about Nietzsche and her essay, which is, what was it entitled again? I should know it. But anyway, it's her article on Nietzsche in Sublation Magazine. It was called "Hope Despite All Doubts," and I'm going to start with this clip from the late great Rick Roderick, who people can see every week on the Diet Soap podcast. He's part of the introductory little clip at every show. Here he is talking about Nietzsche right now.
One of the points I didn't make about the genealogical method in the last lecture I want to make now, and it's very important. When we look genealogically at the Greeks as a type, or Christians and Christianity, Nietzsche uses a kind of typology where we don't look for who speaks in a document, but for, as it were, what motivates the speaker behind the document. So the hermeneutic question of who's the speaker and is he honest isn't really what Nietzsche wants, but to see what kind of type would say something like that. See, the standard philosophical approach to a text would be to look at the propositions and then to determine if the argument is valid, sound, and then if the speaker is sincere, and so on. Nietzsche, rather than looking at that, looks at the question, what kind of person would make an argument like that? What type of person would evaluate like that, rather than to look at the evaluation? That's another way to look at genealogy. Rather than to look directly at the evaluation, you look at the kind, characteristic, or type that would make it. So when I make a remark about master morality, it's about a certain type that speaks in these various evaluatory words. Or about Christian morality, it's about the type, or what human type speaks in these texts.
All right, Jamie, welcome to the Sublation Magazine Show. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to be talking to you about Nietzsche. Before I speak to your essay directly, I wanted to ask you about the concept of imminent critique. We just saw a clip from Rick Roderick wherein he suggested that Nietzsche abandoned the standard philosophical approach wherein one makes arguments and claims that are to be evaluated on the basis of their validity, soundness, and truth, and took up what I'll uncharitably call an ad hominem approach to argumentation. Do you think this approach to philosophical or political inquiry is justified? And what is its relationship to what I'll call, or what we might both call, an imminent critique? And I'm going to put you here. Yeah.
So I'll say first of all, I don't think that Nietzsche is against truth or validity per se, nor do Adorno, Horkheimer, or Benjamin. So the aim of the essay published in Sublation is to kind of offer up the Frankfurt School's reading of Nietzsche as an alternative to other common readings of Nietzsche on the left, both of which, the ones that I have in mind, kind of take up Nietzsche as an irrationalist. On the one hand, there's the critique of Nietzsche, which is largely inspired by Lukács's 1952 Destruction of Reason, which would accuse Nietzsche of irrationalism in kind of complicity with, or a kind of faithfulness to imperialism, racism, chauvinism. So in other words, critique Nietzsche for his kind of irrationalism. And this accords with the project of Lukács's Destruction of Reason, insofar as he's seeking to kind of read into modern German philosophy an irrationalism that ultimately culminates in fascism. So he's kind of reading National Socialism back into German philosophy. And Nietzsche takes up for late Lukács, a large portion of the blame for this. There's more to be said about this, but kind of on the other hand, we have a more a read of Nietzsche, which positively takes up his so-called irrationalism. And this would be a kind of reading in the spirit of Bataille and subsequent French theorists like Klossowski, who's recently elaborated in a piece published in Sublation, which would kind of see in Nietzsche's so-called irrationalism a corrective to what's seen as a kind of repressive conscious ego. So in other words, the kind of turn towards a valorization of unconscious forces would kind of rescue us from the domination of conscious conceptualization, or the kind of myth of constitutive subjectivity. So there's a critique of Nietzsche's irrationalism, and then there's a positive taking up of Nietzsche's irrationalism. The Frankfurt School reads Nietzsche somewhat differently, right? Imminently, as you say. And what's at stake here, as it pertains to the problem of imminent critique and truth and validity, is not a kind of multiplicity of countless meanings, none of which is truer than the next, but rather the possibility for truth or meaning as subject to change. And Nietzsche theorizes this through concepts like self-overcoming or the transvaluation of all values. And so this latter is kind of one aspect of Nietzsche that interests the Frankfurt School.
Okay. So, yeah, I want to know a little bit more about imminent critique, and maybe how the Frankfurt School dealt with the problem of evaluating an argument both historically or as a motivated kind of expression. In other words, when someone makes a particular argument, they're not simply standing outside of history and without any presumptions or presuppositions making a case for reality or to try to determine the truth of reality, but rather are working within a framework which is historically determined and which limits their access to reality, I suppose. So how does the Frankfurt School hold on to the need for some kind of universal reason, which may often be conceived of being able to take a universal view, outside of history, and at the same time situate themselves historically and the people they're critiquing, like Nietzsche, historically, and create a historical critique or an imminent critique?
Yeah. So right. Okay. So the the goal, the attempt would be for a kind of a critical method of thinking, which takes up the materials that are available to it. So in other words, a way of thought that's adequate to its object. And in this way, approach a critical methodology in which these questions of kind of like inside and outside of the object as antinomies need not necessarily be taken as mutually exclusive. So let me clarify this. And maybe we can simply say, define imminent critique as a critique from within. So in other words, a critique of a thing from within that thing. We can see how such an approach would be, preferable to other types of, I guess, philosophical thought. You brought up kind of analytic philosophy, Doug, before our conversation. We could do analysis, we could do argumentation, we can do explication. Why imminent critique? And I think if we follow the Frankfurt School, we can consider imminent critique. Any critique worthy of the name must have a quality of imminence to it, especially after Hegel, after Marx. So, why imminent critique? And this does have to do with, as you pointed out, Doug, a kind of the question of history, the question of a critique of society, which how does one critique something like society from within it, formed by it, in and of it, hence the necessity of the imminent critique, which would take up as its aim the coming to terms with the conditions of possibility for transformation. So it's also, and this too is at stake in Nietzsche, right? The possibility for transformation, self-overcoming, and pointing beyond, but what's important there is the self-overcoming. So not the imposition of a kind of philosophy kind of artificially from the outside.
Okay, so I still am trying to wrap my head around the dichotomy between reason, which would claim a universality, and the understanding that one is historically situated, because it does seem to me that this is an epistemic problem, and that it can have political consequences. Bear with me. I'm going to tell you about something that's way off to the side, but just came to me while we're talking. I've been reading, as always, perpetually reading the same book.
Is it about the Hungarian Revolution by any chance?
No, it's going to be kind of about the Hungarian Revolution, but it's a chapter that mentions the Hungarian Revolution. It's Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle, chapter 4, and in it, he advocates for a more kind of directly democratic approach to revolutionary action, based on a critique of Hegelianism, where the desire for a universal understanding, which is manifest, according to Debord, as a critique of political economy. So the idea that we could step out of political economy, evaluate it as a positive fact about our world, and come to an understanding of it. That critique and that stance, Debord says, leads Marxists to create a vanguard party, which is outside of the proletarian movement, which doesn't understand its situatedness within the socialist struggle, which isn't imminent, and which always ends up reinforcing the capitalist relations that it's supposedly trying to critique. So just taking the critique of political economy as something that we can hold in its totality as kind of reasonable actors itself misses the necessity for imminent critique, according to Debord. And his solution to that is to, all power to the workers' councils and nothing to the Bolsheviks and the vanguard party. So it seems to me that understanding what an imminent critique is, the role for reason in it, is politically important. There are stakes. You could end up in this anti-Bolshevik position, whether it's right or wrong, if you understand this question of imminent critique differently than the Bolsheviks or Lenin or someone like that. So I'll let you respond. What are the stakes here? Do you
There
think?
are stakes. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe this may be somewhat of a tangential answer to your question, but I think I'd like to answer it by thinking about like why Nietzsche is important for the Frankfurt School, and it has to do with the question of what becomes of the Marxist dialectic in the absence of a proletarian politics. This is what Adorno, Horkheimer, and Benjamin are coming up against. In other words, how might one be a Marxist when to be a Marxist is impossible? And so, just to maybe kick it a bit further down the road too, this would be then why both the Frankfurt School and Nietzsche would be important for us as we find ourselves in a kind of similar dilemma, perhaps even exacerbated in the 21st century. And I mean, Adorno poses this question, or rather takes up the form of this question in his approach to art and philosophy as well, when he asks, so what can we say about art when we can't take for granted that its existence is justified, like nothing concerning art is self-evident. Likewise, philosophy lives on even though the moment of its realization is missed. So this question of like kind of continuance beyond kind of the necessity of the thing. So when it comes to the question of the absence of the question of the dialectic in the absence of the proletarian politics, this is one thing that Nietzsche has to offer the Frankfurt School, right? Nietzsche is not he's a critic of socialism. He's a critic of the antinomies of bourgeois society. He's a critic of the dialectic of enlightenment. He does not align himself with the workers. Lukács is right about that. So in other words, Nietzsche situates himself philosophically kind of negatively in relation to his moment. And this is the imminent dialectical critique in Nietzsche that the Frankfurt School sees and takes up.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Frankfurt School a little bit more. One thing I think we should do, in case some viewers aren't familiar, and for Djene, is who were the Frankfurt School philosophers, and how did they emerge? Briefly,
Yeah, briefly. Good. So the Frankfurt School, the Frankfurt School comes out of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt in the mid-20th century. There are many thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School. I primarily focus on Adorno and Horkheimer and Benjamin. I think they influence each other, and Nietzsche's influence is most clear in these thinkers. The Frankfurt School thinkers take up what they call critical theory, which is bound up with Marxist critique, imminent dialectical critique, as we're saying, and also sociology, literary criticism, philosophy, aesthetics, etc., all kind of inform the critique of society and capitalism of the Frankfurt School.
So Adorno wrote a book. Okay, go ahead, Djene. You haven't said anything so far. Go ahead.
I mean, like I will say this, like I find the Frankfurt School quite difficult because I'm not big brained like you guys. I don't like Schoenberg. It sounds terrible to me. And it sounds a lot like grumpy old Germans complaining that there are 32 channels and nothing to watch on the TV. But I'm sure I'm being a little bit dismissive there. But what I actually wanted to ask is on the left, there is like this common conception. Nietzsche is a forerunner to fascism. He is an enemy of the left. And what I thought was particularly interesting about your piece was, kind of try and reverse that reading of Nietzsche as, like as irredeemable fascist, right? If you were giving the pitch, right, to someone about, no, you should read Nietzsche because there's value in it to the left, how would you summarize that pitch to a Philistine like me, who is not, who may be like aware of politics, but does not have like necessarily a deep philosophical understanding of the high theory stakes that are taking place?
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting question because, one doesn't need to pitch Nietzsche. People read Nietzsche. People are still reading Nietzsche. They don't need to be convinced, right? There's something kind of seductive and attractive about Nietzsche. Adorno needs to be pitched. Marx needs to be pitched, perhaps, but not Nietzsche. So this is an interesting question. Why, right? What is it about Nietzsche that, entices people to continue to take him up in all of these different forms? Whereas there's not so much like various different schools of like Adornian thought, right? Mm-hmm. So one thing I would say is that I wouldn't want to, I don't need to pitch Nietzsche, but I want to pitch, I want to, make the claim that it's insofar as Nietzsche tasks us with the question of how to read him, it's worthwhile to think through the Frankfurt School's reading of Nietzsche as a critic of the dialectic of enlightenment and as a critic of the antinomies of bourgeois society. Why? Because they still weigh upon us and because we're still suffering as a result of them. And I think that a lot of the kind of, the critique of Nietzsche on the so-called left that would relegate him to the dustbin of history on the basis of his kind of, retroactive complicity with fascism is actually based in a profound disappointment, meaning, things ought to be otherwise. Things didn't really turn out the way that they were supposed to. Think about like the 21st century is not going very well, right? It's not going very well. People are still reading Nietzsche. So what do we want Nietzsche to do to us? What do we want Nietzsche to do to us? How do we want to take him up? And the reading of Nietzsche as like a kind of late young Hegelian or an anti-Hegelian Hegelian, as I think Benjamin and Adorno and Horkheimer take him up, is worthwhile then for us, in the absence of Marxism, in the absence of proletarian politics.
Okay, I have a question. So you said earlier that Nietzsche related to the society that he found himself in, the society that was determining the basis of his critique negatively. Mm-hmm. And I just vaguely remember that Adorno and Horkheimer wrote a book called Negative Dialectics, right? So is that right?
You might be thinking of Dialectic of Enlightenment.
Oh, okay.
Adorno did write Negative Dialectics.
Adorno, okay, right. So that that negativity that's in Adorno, in Negative Dialectics, how does it relate to Nietzschean negativity?
That's a great question. So let me say before getting into it that, of course, these things are complex and people spend their entire lives thinking through the dialectic, and then we have the negative dialectic. And Adorno himself, has this bit where he says, well, you may wonder why I add the term negative to dialectic when dialectic itself contains an element of negation. And what he says is that the negation of the negation ends up positive anyway. So hence the addition of the negative. He wants to kind of make sure it's not taken as a tautology. But that aside, the question is, what about negative dialectics for Nietzsche? So how to say, it does come back to the question of kind of sustained reflection on limitations to conditions of possibility or limitations to the possibility of critique. And so Nietzsche is looking at history and society and religion in this way. And it's, an approach that seeks a philosophy in the service of life, meaning in the service of this life, not some life beyond. So I think that this is kind of a maybe somewhat abstract answer to your question, Doug. Maybe I need a little more direction.
Okay, let me try again, because so my understanding is that Adorno wanted to advocate for open thinking. He was a critic of actionism, or just activity that didn't take in the totality of the system that we were trying to change. The kind of activism that would inadvertently prop up the relations or even do damage to bourgeois society rather than push us ahead into socialism. This open thinking for Adorno, I believe, meant taking the position wherein one was not directly didn't have to directly engage in political activity in a given moment, that one could allow oneself to be useless. I mean, art was useless.
Mm.
It was that you could not that you could escape society that way, but just that you could take a negative position. You could say, I would prefer not to, overall, and then allow yourself the space to think, maybe fantasize, make arguments that wouldn't have stakes immediately.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not quite.
Okay.
So but I appreciate you're right. Like Nietzsche and Adorno are both critiqued as reactionary, right? Adorno for his failure to enthusiastically support the student activist protests in the late 60s, and Nietzsche for his failure to align himself with the working class movement for socialism, both as critics of socialism and of the kind of leftist politics of their time. But I don't think that Adorno's concept of open thinking would kind of leave itself I don't think Adorno is kind of advocating a sort of drop out, right? It's actually of necessity. It's not. Sorry, I just got distracted because questions are flashing up on the screen.
Djene is trying to distract us.
Okay.
He's flashing questions on the screen. Ignore those.
It's like a gauntlet. It's like
that's just a rabble. They're just mumbling in the background. Ignore the rabble. Go on.
So, if I refer in my essay to a 1942 conversation about a paper presented by Ludwig Marcuse, not Herbert Ludwig, in which Adorno identifies Nietzsche as a thinker who kind of was prescient in the sense that he recognized the limitations of organization and praxis, in other words, practical politics, in such a way that has since become more true. And for Adorno and the Frankfurt School broadly, it's about the question of historical regression. So, the kind of possibility for an international, any sort of kind of like viable international Marxist socialist movement is off the table, certainly by the 60s. So, Adorno's not really saying like, oh, well, I prefer not to, and I'm just going to go to my armchair and write. It's the practical and to some degree objective limitations of his historical moment, which puts him in the position to, almost kind of relegates him to this position of critique in which he finds himself, like what has become of Marxist critique.
Right. Okay. So now, not to be elitist and accused of being on the side of Nietzsche, I'll go back to these questions that were popped up on the before. So someone says, to what extent did Walter Kaufmann try to whitewash Nietzsche? And then the other question, if you could do them both to see, how can Nietzsche come to be a critique of regression of the left in Marxism? How does that help to recover Marxism? Those are the two. They're taking over for me. The rabble is taken over for me. I'm not needed anymore. Go ahead, Jamie.
Good. I'll answer the first question first. Mm-hmm. That is that, when Walter Kaufmann publishes his biography of Nietzsche in the 1950s, he is kind of, his is an attempt to redeem Nietzsche from the accusations of complicity with fascism. I guess that there's this accusation of whitewashing. I think in order to make this accusation, one would have to, as I think I mentioned earlier, like read back into Nietzsche the tenets of National Socialism. We can think about what Nietzsche is doing in the late 19th century, in relation to the conditions of his time. But then, we could take up like Nazism and Hitler's love for Nietzsche and push that back onto Nietzsche. We could do that. But if we do that, and only that, then something will be lost. Now, I don't think we need to forgive Nietzsche for any reactionary elements in his thinking and in his writing. And I don't think that the Frankfurt School felt we needed to do that either. They were not entirely sanguine about Nietzsche. But, as I said, something is lost if we, remove him from our bookshelves for these reasons. And Walter Kaufmann, I mean, his is a reading of Nietzsche that has kind of fallen out of favor in academia. But, I think Kaufmann, to my mind, one limitation of the Kaufmann is the kind of, he wants to take up positively the concept of individualism in Nietzsche. But what I think Kaufmann does well is recognize the way in which Nietzsche's kind of objects of critique are also his biggest influences. So he'll read, for example, Nietzsche's critique of Rousseau in this way. So it is a Hegelian-inspired reading of Nietzsche, and I think there's something there in Kaufmann's reading for us. In response to Danny's question, which was the significance of Nietzsche for Marxism, I think, we would ideally, I think, I'm advocating turning to the Frankfurt School's reading of Nietzsche to answer this question, which goes back to the question of Marxism without the party, Marxism after the possibility for the party. And then also, in a sense, Nietzsche is kind of more important to Adorno than Marx is. And that has to do with the historical conditions in which Adorno finds himself and his attempt to, offer a critique that is adequate to those conditions.
Okay. I'm going to see if I can, because there's been a lot of, I'm noticing in the chat, there are a variety of reactions. Some of them, I would say, are pretty much identical to the sorts of critiques of Nietzsche that you are trying to correct in your essay. Someone writes, Trump is a Dionysian ideal. He has no beliefs other than hedonism and power. Can you deny this? Can you deny this? All right. So, what I will, I want to ask you kind of at the end here is about the will to power as opposed to the will to truth, which you address in your essay, because this gets back to the kind of questions that I lobbed at you at the beginning and with the Rick Roderick. Maybe this would be a way to wrap up your interview. And by the way, you should come back and talk about Nietzsche or anything else you'd like sometime. But how is truth situated in the thought of Nietzsche, and maybe also in within any imminent critique? Because the question still remains, how do we take up a universal reason to guide our critiques, to inform our understandings of imminent critiques, and how do we get inside of our moment or the moment of a thinker who we're critiquing rationally? So how is it that truth is still an important part of Nietzsche's mode? And also, what was his relationship to the will to power in reality? Because I think what you said in your essay was that, in fact, he saw the change from the will to power to the will to truth as a positive development towards freedom. And so I'm setting you up here.
Did I say that?
I think you might have.
Well, okay. Well, I'll come back to something I said earlier, which is that I don't think that Nietzsche is anti-truth. I think that Nietzsche's approach to truth is dialectical, insofar as the world is both knowable and interpretable. I think that one common characterization of Nietzsche's approach to truth is kind of bound up in the kind of pithy slogan, "No facts, only interpretation." Right. But this is not entirely adequate to Nietzsche's characterization of interpretation, meaning facts, empirical facts, or knowledge of the world is not necessarily directly opposed to interpreting the world. And so I guess the question of will to power versus will to truth also brings up the question of how we characterize or how we understand Nietzsche's understanding of power. And I think it's really easy to kind of take up will to power as like, this kind of dominating force. We might think of war or machine guns or this sort of thing. But for Nietzsche, it's not power over, it's the power of an individual, right? A power within, as a kind of self-overcoming, self-determining, and also in the sense of self-overcoming, self-undermining force, like a force in the service of life. And so I guess in terms of one other thing that I would say about, well, now I'm getting caught up. I guess I want to come back to like this misunderstanding or the question of how we understand Nietzsche's use of the word power, right? Not only as, or not primarily as, a force of, or let's just say not as, a force of domination of others, right? Because Nietzsche is an anti-authoritarian. He's anti-authoritarian, right? So, and also in this regard is a philosopher of freedom.
Okay. Question from Ian Adelston. Does Bertrand Russell's treatment of Nietzsche in the history of philosophy still influence a general negative understanding of Nietzsche's thought?
Oh, well, admittedly, I'm sorry to say I can't speak to that. I'm not familiar with the Bertrand Russell.
That's fine, but he paid us $5, so I had to ask the question. And anybody who wants to drop a super chat in right now.
$5. Oh, that's, yeah.
So for that $5, your question was read, but not answered. That's how it goes. Listen, Jamie, thank you very much for coming on. What I want to do now, I'm not going to do it now. I'll do it later today or tomorrow or something, but I want to watch our conversation and just evaluate how it went, because I feel like you gave very good answers, some that need to sink in. So people should come back and watch this interview over and over and over again. That will help us with the algorithm as well. All right. Thank you for coming on.
And thank you for writing for Sublation Magazine. We really appreciated your piece.
Oh, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yep. Okay, so now we're going to wrap up the show for everybody. So I want to let people know that there's going to be a patron-only show in about 20 minutes on our Patreon. So if you sign up for $8 a month, you can gain access to that second hour of the Sublation Magazine Show and directly support Sublation Magazine. Also remind everyone that we're doing meetups across the country and soon across the world. Clint is an admin at Sublation. He can let you know where the meetings are being held. We've got a meeting in Chicago, Miami, and San Diego on Friday, and Brooklyn on Saturday. Write to Clint M at sublationmedia.com if you're interested in that. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., I'll be talking to Terry Pinkard and Slavoj Žižek about Hegel, and maybe I'll throw in a question about Nietzsche just to
spice it up.
Spice everything up.
Spice everything up.
And was there anything I'm forgetting, Djene?
No, nothing you're forgetting. Just we're going to be talking about Sri Lanka and the fall of the president there and what that means for the rest of the world. What does it tell us? And we will have Deep State Cuba with his great knowledge of international relations, who has a hard out at 11 o'clock. And then we'll have Spencer Leonard, the editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine, who is also an expert on Southeast Asian history. So we're going to be entering the Spencer Leonard zone.
All right. I'm going to run the little intro as an outro, and then everyone should join us in the Patreon Parrot Room for Sri Lanka conversation, and who knows what else I'll try to bring up. Here we go.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate